Welcome back to Building the Basics. This podcast is dedicated to helping prospective and first-time firearm owners in the decision-making journey by helping you define your whys and walking you through the hows. See us as that relative helping you buy a new car or, in this case, a new gun.
In this episode, we have our friend Tyler joining us to talk about competition shooting. I know both Marvin and I are really excited to have Tyler on so that we can have a fun conversation about what does it look like to get out to your first match. And a couple pieces of background information. So Tyler is on both Instagram and YouTube with the handle of Off the Draw. Then a couple impressive classifications that you have, Tyler. It's you've achieved Grandmaster in the Steel Challenge part of the sport, and then in USPSA Carry Optics, you've achieved the Master Class. So I'll turn it over to you, Tyler, if there's anything that you want to add.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks for Marvin for having me on. Excited to be here. So, based on the target audience, they might not know what Grandmaster or Master mean, but I'm hoping by the end of the episode we can clear that up for them. But yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you guys about competition shooting because I think that there's a perception among new shooters that competition shooting is for advanced shooters only, and that's not really true. And I think the earlier that you can get into competition as a new gun owner, the better you're going to be in the long run. So, I want to kind of dive into all things that will destigmatize competition shooting to the new shooter.
Nice. Now, before we get into actually diving in, I was remiss at the very beginning. I wanted to make sure that we gave you our specialty gift of, if you remember our episode 2, gave our friend Dave a bag of grass-fed beef jerky. So, Tyler, I hope you like some beef jerky. You can open it now. We can enjoy it together, or you're more than welcome to take it home and be selfish and enjoy it yourself.
Well, we're gonna have to at least try it together.
All right, that sounds good.
There's always room for some extra protein in my diet, so let's crack this guy open and see if it's as good as it looks.
It is pretty tasty.
Oh, that is good. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks, man.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Alrighty. So, competition shooting. Let's talk.
Competition shooting. So, I think most people who are just new to the firearms community don't really have a firm concept of what competition shooting is. I think everyone's aware that there's competition shooting, right? You see it in the Olympics, which it actually became pretty popular this year. There were a lot of memes made around competition shooters because of that one shooter.
I think he's Turkey.
Yeah.
Yep. That was great.
That made the rounds on social media, just shooting with no equipment, just raw dogging it out there with no special glasses or gloves or anything. But it got people talking about it.
Yeah.
And I mean, even myself, someone who grew up with firearms, I think at a young age, I understood that competition shooting has always been around. As long as there's been firearms, there's been people that wanted to see who was the best shot, who could reload their muzzle loader the fastest. But it didn't really feel accessible to me. So a little bit of my background. I was in the Navy for 8 years. Half of that I spent with the Marine Corps. And when you tell someone that you were attached to an infantry unit, they assume that means you get a lot of shooting under your belt, and you don't. Right, so when I was with the infantry, I could probably say in that time I didn't even shoot a full case of ammo.
Wait, in 4 years, not even shooting 1,000 rounds?
No, and you have to bear in mind, I was a Navy corpsman, so my job was medical, and there was a lot of times where I had to be essentially on duty, making sure everyone was safe while they got to shoot. And then it wasn't necessarily required of me to qualify with a rifle. I had to know how to shoot it.
Yep.
And I had to do one qualification in field medical training, but then after that, it was kind of optional for me. So,
your Marines screwed you. Your Marines screwed you. They totally screwed you.
They did and they didn't. I mean, part of it was they would invite me to qual all the time, and I would tell them, I was like, I don't really need a ribbon to tell you guys that I can shoot. I was like, I've been shooting since I was a kid. But, in all that time, I didn't get as much shooting in as I wanted to. So when I got out of the Navy, I went back to college, graduated college, and I wanted to get into the firearms industry. And so I ended up getting a job at a local gun range, running their training program, as well as maintaining range operations. And in that, I wanted to become a better shooter, right? If you're going to run a training program, shooting is one of those skills where if you're going to teach it, you have to be able to demonstrate that you actually are proficient at it. And so I got into competition shooting originally to become a better instructor and to understand the training side of things in a much more nuanced way. And over time, it turned into, I am just doing this because it's fun now, and I'm not as worried about the instructor side of things anymore. It became very addictive. But originally, I had no idea how to get into competition shooting. So one night, I had a case of insomnia, and I was up probably until 4 a.m, just doing absolutely nothing. Like, this wasn't like a night after partying or anything. I just couldn't sleep. And I ended up doing a deep dive on the internet, trying to figure out how to sign up for a competition, Googling things, following links, looking at message boards. And it didn't take me too long to get myself registered for my first competition. I fell asleep shortly after that. And then when I woke up a few hours later into the morning, I'd forgotten that I'd done it. And then it dawned on me. I was like, oh, yeah, I have a competition next weekend that I'm going to that I know nothing about. I was very self-taught. And I think that if you don't have friends within the community, it can be hard to find. And working as the range master at the gun range that I was at, I would get customers all the time asking me like, hey, do you have any idea how you're supposed to even find these matches? Because they're not very well advertised. So that's actually why I started my YouTube channel, was to educate people on competition shooting and to get those new shooters out there if they don't have friends in the community, if they don't have someone who can walk them through the process.
That makes sense. And it's funny. So when you mentioned, you went down a rabbit hole trying to figure out how to get involved, that's the exact same thing I went through probably. So I really only started competing or doing matches within the last, maybe call it year and a half. And that's, conservative. Probably it was like last spring. So about a year and a half or so. But I had been a member, quote unquote, of USPSA for probably a good 3-4 years. And I was just trying to figure out, okay, like I'm a member now. I'm trying to figure out how do you get into matches. And like you said, it's not advertised well. There's really not a good way to like do the right thing of, oh, do you go here to sign up or there wasn't a very clear way to do it. So yeah, I had the same thing. I experienced the same thing that you did. So after doing the first one or two, then you start to meet people and then you start to just communicate with them, and then they'll be like, oh, go here, go here, go here. There's another range at, the opposite side of the state. And it's being where we are, it didn't really seem that there was a lot locally for a long time until SIG opened up, their kind of competition / shooting matches part of their program kind of thing. So at least that's my personal experience that I found. Now, granted, I know that you were able to find other places outside of, the Seacoast area, but I mean...
Yeah. And I'll get into how to sign up for a match because, it isn't intuitive, but in today's day and age, it is highly centralized. So once you know how to do it, it becomes really simple. But before we get there, I do kind of just want to talk about broadly. So if you're listening to the show, your first question is probably like, who's competition shooting for and is it for me? Right? So the first thing that I would tell people is, and this is based on feedback I've gotten from potential competitive shooters, is they tell me, oh, I would love to do that, but I want to get better first. And usually I ask them like, well, let's define better. Like, what are your skills right now? And what I would say is if you're a new gun owner, you definitely should seek training first. Right? We live in a different world than what I grew up in, right? Like growing up in the 90s in rural Washington state, everybody learned how to shoot from their dad or from their uncle, right? I got my first rifle when I was 11. I lived on a farm, so my summers were spent like shooting varmints, trying to protect crops and protect the cattle from all of these. They're called sage rats. I don't think they have them out here on the East Coast, but I had a Henry lever action 22 that I still have. And that was my introduction to shooting. But nowadays, a lot of people are getting into firearms for the first time in their 20s or in their 30s or even 40s, right? And so maybe they don't have that older mentor in their personal life who can show them the ropes. And even if you do, what astonished me getting into firearms training was just how valuable professional instruction is. There's a lot of people who try and learn how to shoot from things like YouTube or reading forums or Reddit or just trial and error out at the retail range. And even someone who, as someone who grew up with firearms, sitting through my first Handgun 101 class, I was blown away by the amount of information.
That you didn't know.
Well, yeah, and even if I did know it, some of the information I knew, but having it explained to me in a different way opened up my mind conceptually to what it is that I should be focusing on. So I would say start there and get some basic training, but once you've reached the point where you can draw and holster a gun safely and you're able to manipulate the gun confidently, so, racking the slide to the rear, checking it to make sure it's safe, changing magazines, remedial actions if you have a malfunction. If you can do those things confidently, I'm not saying proficiently, but confidently, and then you think you can incorporate some movement into that, at that point, that's really all you need to get into competition shooting.
And realistically, based on the classes that I've seen and taken, usually it's around that, like, whether it's H3 or Handgun 103, whatever, classes call it, or intermediate handgun, there's different names, of course, depending on where you go. Usually it's around that third, maybe tail end of the third class or second half of that third class where you do start a little bit of that movement. Now, you're not moving fast. You're not, going from one side to the other, doing barrel rolls and everything like that. You're just incorporating some walking or some movement forward or backward, something like that.
If you can chew gum and walk at the same time, you're going to be okay ultimately. Right. And one thing that you said that I think is important to point out too, I'm not even necessarily saying shooting on the move. Can you move, then shoot, then move again without overloading your sensory system, right? If you can do that, you can get into competition shooting.
Right.
And then another thing I hear all the time is people say, yeah, but I don't want to come in last. They're like, yeah, I could probably do it, but I'm going to suck. And what I tell them is, I'm like, look, you're not going to be last. Statistically speaking, you're probably not going to, because what they don't realize is there's such a huge spectrum of skill at these competitions. You have guys and gals who are in their senior years, essentially walking the stages, like just short of a walker, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Walking these stages, kind of taking their time, hitting the targets. Nobody minds that those people are there. In fact, they encourage it. They love it. Mm-hmm. But, really competition shooting in its essence is, how am I performing based on what I believe my perceived skill level is? And then once you've done it a few times, you create a foundation where it's like, okay, did I do better than my last competition? Mm-hmm. And so really it is just about testing and checking your own skills. Mm-hmm.
So let's pull it back real quick for 1 second, because we're talking a lot about competition. And I think what I'm hearing you say, Tyler, is that competition shooting shouldn't be viewed as a competition against necessarily all of the other folks that you're shooting with, but it should be, more of a competition against, am I better than myself yesterday? Am I a better shooter than myself the last time I was at a shooting competition? Would that be a better way of approaching it? Because when people hear competition, I have to be the best, right? I'm going into a foot race competition. I want to be the fastest runner. I'm not necessarily competing against myself. I'm competing against all of the other runners. Same thing with any other sport. And so when we're looking at it from a sport lens that is within the frame of reference that most people have, it is, hey, I'm trying to beat the other people that I'm in this competition with.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think that Another way to put it is if somebody asked you to go golfing one day and you said, "Oh, I'm not going to go golfing because I'll never make the PGA Tour," then you would laugh at them and you'd be like, "That doesn't make any sense. Like, let's just go golfing and see how you are."
Yeah.
And once you've done that, once you've gone to a competition or two, you're going to determine who your peer group is, right? There was an evolutionary process for me where I started to see recurring names at competitions,
Yep.
and I'd see that they were maybe 2 or 3 positions ahead of me, and then I would find out who those people were, and then they became my new benchmark, right? That's my pace car. I want to try and keep up with that person, and then that evolves over time. So I think you're spot on, and a big part of it too, and I think this is a great segue, is what's the point in competition? Right? And a lot of people think that competition is just for fun, and there's no practical point to it. And I think that in itself is a topic that could take up an entire podcast episode because it's such a contentious position. But what I'll tell you, my quick opinion on it is that it's a healthy mix of practical and competition fun, right? Like I would compare it to something like if you're focused on building your cardio, you can go run a couple miles every week, or you could go play soccer. Which one's going to get you working on your cardio more often? If you gamify it and you're getting your heart rate up, are you improving your cardio? And if so,
absolutely.
Exactly. And if that's the case,
both. The answer is both. Like both will do it, but when you gamify it, when you are doing it, quote unquote, with a purpose. Like I'm not a fan of running. I'm also not a fan of soccer. But like if I had to choose, I would play soccer versus just going out for a run because it's a fun activity. It's a sport. I like sports just in general to play.
Right, you're doing it with other people.
Yeah.
You're creating a sense of camaraderie, and who doesn't love a little healthy competition?
Yeah.
So
Well, and when you add stress to it, and you also are there are stakes at the end of this, right? So when you're shooting the flat range, there are no stakes, there's no stress. Those things aren't pushing you to be a better shooter. They're not pushing you to and additionally with competition shooting, all of that stuff is recorded. So I know how I did on each stage. I know how quickly I was, you get that feedback as opposed to when you're shooting on a flat range. Hey, I put a bunch of rounds down range. How long did I take? I don't know, right? Did I put them all in the bullseye? Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm going to pull it back. I'm going to look at it. I have my feedback. All right, right. And there's this, I guess it puts something in us as human beings when we're like, oh, hey, I want to put as many hits in an A zone as possible within a specific time frame. And there's a timer that goes off. It goes beep. Now I'm actually, got a sense of urgency. There's something that's pushing me to do something different as opposed to just going, hey, I just fired my 150 rounds for the month. Okay, I'm going home now, right?
Yeah, and I know that, Marvin, I know that we want to try and get into that topic specifically, like using range time like for a purpose. And I know that we got somebody lined up within the next probably 3-4 weeks or so that's going to, discuss, what does training with a purpose look like? So, here's the thing. It's like there's so many of these topics that we have that's like that's an episode in and of itself. That's an episode in and of itself, which is great because it's good content, and we just want to make sure that we're giving the audience what little taste of things here and there for the next stuff down the road. Because if we were talking about that in this, it'd be like 10 hours long.
Well, yeah, and so much of it overlaps.
Oh,
right?
100%.
I mean,
yeah,
training, competition shooting. The mindset, the tactical mindset that comes with things like home defense or carrying out in public, concealed carrying, like a lot of that, there's overlap. And so, on the other end of the spectrum, not to get into the training side too much, but I do want to kind of just pin this point to it. On the other side of the spectrum, you'll have people that say, yeah, competition's too gamified though, and you're habituating skills or techniques that are not effective in the real world. And to those people, I would say, well, how many competitions have you shot? And it's probably not very many, if at all. And then on top of that, I would also argue that, like, okay, the things that you're seeing in competition that don't seem like they make sense on a tactical level, well, you know, you're not a robot, and you know that, like, you're not going to be like leaning really far out around a wall to take a shot, balancing on one foot, or running through a door without checking your sectors and things like that. That, like, it's kind of a nonsensical argument. Right. So, and, you know, I would say at the end of the day, the easiest way I can put it to someone is, will competition shooting make you the world's best gunfighter? No, because if you talk to anyone who's ever been in a gunfight, they're going to tell you that there's a lot more to combat than what's going on in a competition event, right? Mm-hmm. But I will tell you that if you try hard enough and you were to push yourself to the extreme, it could make you one of the world's best gun handlers, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is the biggest thing that you can take from competition shooting is in the practical competition sphere, you are manipulating a gun under time and pressure in a multitude of different ways. Learning how to navigate obstacles while handling a loaded firearm at that speed and intensity, and being able to get your hits, deal with malfunctions, increase your, here's a $10 word, proprioception, right? Okay. Which is your ability to understand the physical space around you.
Okay.
Kind of on a sensory level.
Yep.
Right? Things like that are so important that those skills vastly outweigh any quote unquote impractical nature of the sport itself.
And everything that you said while being safe.
While being safe.
Right. So, because and we might get into this a little bit, but it's like, there are safety requirements that you have to follow, otherwise you get disqualified.
Yes.
So it's like these matches or competitions that people go to, you know, that we go to, it's like, yeah, there are people that will get disqualified for a number of reasons, and we're not going to, you know, list out all of them, but just for our audience to know, yes, there is a safety standard that we have to abide by in order to be a competitor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to circle back to what you were talking about, Tyler, on whether it was impractical, because I think what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a lot of the military is actually incorporating competitive shooting aspects into training. And, you know, you said you're in the Navy, I was in the Marines, I was infantry. I made sure that any of the corpsmen that were attached to my squad got as much time on the trigger as they wanted. But where I'm saying is, you know, would I have been a better gunfighter if I had gotten into competitive shooting or incorporated a lot of those things when I was in the Marine Corps and I was training for a deployment and I was going into a combat zone? Absolutely. I think, you know, a lot of the things that you're talking about, being able to manipulate your firearm, get shots off with when you're not balanced, when you don't have sure footing, when you're having to lean around corners, that happens. When, you know, you may have to lean around a corner. Target identification. You know, how many matches do we shoot where they have an obscured target, you have a no shoot in front of that target, whatever the case might be. So I think, you know, for all of the folks out there who say, hey, there are impracticalities to competitive shooting from a tactical standpoint, you know, I think that one, we're not everybody's going to be a military tactical gunfighter and needs to rely on those things, but just by equipping any gun owner with the ability to react under stress, you know, to your point, maneuver around obstacles, you know, navigate obstacles, you know, shoot from uncomfortable positions and get hits off. I think all of those things are absolutely important for any gun owner or anybody who may encounter a scenario where they're going to use their firearm. I think all of those things are absolutely, you know, applicable in a defensive situation.
Yeah, I completely agree, Marvin. I think it's great that you brought that up because I just saw an article from I think it was Military Times, that the other day that said the Marine Corps is introducing pack timers into its training, which is great. So I think now would be a good time to kind of take a step back from the whys and just kind of broadly talk about, like, when we say competition shooting, what exactly are we talking about, right? Because the world of shooting sports is really large. You have what you see in the Olympics, which is precision shooting. You have, shotgun sports, so skeet, trap, sporting clays. But I think typically when you say competition shooting in the kind of the 2A or gun sphere, most people who have been around long enough know that you're referring to practical shooting, which is mostly what we're discussing today. And so practical shooting really is the concept of, let's take scenarios that make sense from a real world perspective, like a utilitarian use of your firearm, and incorporate that into training. So, we're not talking about precision bullseye shooting, slow fire. We're talking about you have multiple targets with or without barriers that you may have to navigate around, and under the pressure of time, you're trying to shoot as accurately as possible, as fast as you can. So if you're trying to get into that world of competition shooting, there's a couple different governing bodies that you're going to see going into that world. Probably the most notable one, or the kind of the longest standing one, would be IPSC or USPSA, and I'll explain what those are real quick. Basically, IPSC is the International Practical Shooting Confederation, and USPSA is the American chapter of that, and that just stands for United States Practical Shooters Association, if I'm remembering that correctly. I think it was founded in the 70s, 1976, something like that, and it was started by military and law enforcement members as a way to do what we're describing, which is, how do we become more proficient in our gun handling? And so beyond USPSA, you have things like PCSL, a bunch of acronyms coming at you. PCSL, which is the Practical Competition Shooting League, which is kind of the new kid on the block, and they're trying to kind of make things a little bit more intuitive, kind of reduce the size of the rule book, because, as you'll find out as you go down this rabbit hole of competition shooting, that things get pretty muddled down in bureaucracy on the rule side of things.
I was just looking at the USPSA rulebook today. I was trying to figure out what division a certain gun would fit in, and I was looking at the rulebook, and I had forgotten. It's been a little bit since I looked at it. It's like 113 or 134. I don't know. So it's over 100 pages long for the rulebook, and it's like, you go to a match, and I say that I don't want to intimidate anybody that is like, oh my gosh, I have to read 134 or 113 whatever pages, to understand the rules. No, go and talk to somebody who, and hopefully us, or go speak with somebody at the range or somebody that and the nice thing is, if you go to a match and it's your first match, you tell the range officer or somebody there that looks like they know what they're doing. They're gonna walk you through it. They'll be like, okay, here's what you do. Here's what we're gonna I'll walk through this with on each stage with you. I want you to do well, this and that and the other thing, and they'll calm you down. They want you to succeed. They want you to have fun as well. So no, don't feel like you got to read 100 and whatever pages in order to understand stuff. I still don't know everything that's in the rule book. It's not consumable. So yes, PCSL, I like what they're doing with trying to make it much more consumable and easier for people to get into.
Yeah. When you show up to your first match, if you don't know what division you're in based on the equipment you're using, or even how the match really works, that's okay. Like, you show up to a match, you let the match director know that you're brand new to this. They're going to team you up with some people that are going to walk you through it every step of the way. And they're going to be super encouraging while they do it. So they're really, I don't want anyone to think that there's any pressure to go out there and become well-versed in the nuances between these shooting sports.
Right.
I do want to just kind of briefly talk specifically about Steel Challenge, and because I personally think Steel Challenge is a great entry level. It's the gateway shooting sport. in my opinion. That's going to open up your world. And the reason I say that is because a couple things about Steel Challenge that are different than USPSA that make them more accessible to new shooters. So Steel Challenge is a speed shooting competition. There's very little movement at all. Most stages in Steel Challenge, you're stationary, and it's simply drawing your weapon, firing at 5 steel targets as fast as you can, and you do that 5 times. They take your 4 best times, they put those together, and then that's your score for the stage. So it's literally just speed shooting. There's, I think, one stage where you actually move under the clock, but you're talking about moving laterally 3 yards, and that's it. So it's very easy for someone who is just getting into the sport, maybe the idea of having to do all of these things while moving around and keep track of all these different targets is kind of overwhelming. You're always going to have 5 targets. Every single Steel Challenge match you're going to go to, most, if not all of the stages are going to be classifier stages. And what I mean by classifier stages is it's a standardized stage that is used to determine what your skill level is. So you're going to see the same stages over and over and over again, and you have the ability to kind of gamify it even further by knowing the order in which you want to shoot these targets. And then you'll have familiarity, so you're constantly trying to beat your best previous time. I have a video on my YouTube channel on how to get into Steel Challenge specifically.
I remember watching that. It's a good video.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my most popular video right now, and it's getting up there in views. So I'm glad that, and I've had several people comment that watching my video gave them the confidence to go to their first match.
Nice.
So if you're listening and that's something you're interested in, check that out on my channel. And then I also have one that talks about Steel Challenge and USPSA more broadly, and then explains how to sign up for a match, which we will talk about a little later here, just so we're not leaving anyone hanging out there.
For sure.
But yeah, so I think Steel Challenge is a great entry point. And then USPSA and PCSL are very, very similar in that in the structure of those matches is you'll have an area that you're allowed to shoot within. You'll have targets, some behind barriers, some not, and it's your responsibility to determine what is the order in which I'm going to engage these targets, from what positions am I going to engage them, are there so many targets that I have to make a reload, and if so, where am I going to make my reloads? So there's a little bit of strategy that goes into it as well. But I would even say that that's a plus, right? In that, like, a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's not realistic because you're never going to know where the threat's coming from. It's like, yeah, but that's not the point. The point is that you're learning how to process information in your brain at the same time that you're doing other actions on a subconscious level, right? Like when you first start trying to perform at a higher speed, it becomes hard. You might end up outrunning your headlights, right? And you'll flub a reload, or you'll forget what you were going to do next after you did this last thing. And learning how to kind of cement some of those skills in your mind so that way you can focus on what the next task is, I think is super beneficial for someone in the shooting world.
I'll give you the perfect example, actually. So just yesterday, shot the USPSA match, and one of the stages you had to do 2 shots with 2 hands on 4 targets, do a mandatory reload, and then engage with strong hand only on all 4 targets again. And then you have that second go through where you do that same 2 shots with 2 hands on each target, but then you do your support hand only. Right. So on the first go through where it was strong hand only on that second round, or the second part of the string, I had did my mandatory reload, engaged that first target, but what I didn't realize is I was so focused on, getting my gun back up, I didn't fully seat the magazine into the into the mag well, right? So what happened was I took that first shot, it was good, but then the mag fell out, and then my subconscious just completely took over, and I just did my reload. Everything was, it felt really good, and then just engaged the other 3 targets. So exactly what you said, Tyler. You have all this, planning and work to get going where you know what you're doing, and then you have your subconscious take over. In that kind of a failure, quote unquote failure scenario, yeah, my subconscious took over, and I did a reload, and I was good to go to continue then you have to get out of your head for that next string because you still have to do another string for your support hand only. And then it's like, okay, take a breath. Just, what are you going to do? All that. So yeah, there's a mental aspect to it too, which, that's a whole other topic. But yeah, that what you're talking about, subconscious, for sure. And that comes over time. That is not going to happen your first match.
No, your magazine might fall out of the mag well, and then you just have a complete, now what? Meltdown in your brain, and you're like just standing there staring at your gun, like wondering what I'm supposed to do next. Yeah. So, working through that kind of stuff, super beneficial. But yeah, so ultimately, I would say that if you're not sure where to get started, just start doing your research into the different types of formats that exist, and you're going to find an entry level for you. And even if you want to just dive right into something like USPSA or PCSL, like we said earlier, somebody will be there to walk you through the process. I've seen people that basically can draw the gun safely, but not at speed, and they can only do one thing at a time, right? So I'm going to walk here, and then I'm going to shoot, and then I'm going to stop, perform a reload, then I'm going to walk here and I'm going to shoot. And that's fine. And that's great. And people love that because we just want to see the sport grow, right? The more people that get into it, I think it's better for everybody. I'm not a proponent of mandatory firearms training for civilians. I know there's a lot of people that are. I think that leaving that up to the responsibility of the individual is kind of part of what makes America great. But at the same time, I would feel a lot more confident if I knew that the people in our communities that are carrying firearms in public had the level of proficiency that, say, a B or an A class USPSA shooter has, right? And it is nice having this classification system because once you reach one of those classifications, it's pretty accurate to, I know what your capabilities are based on what you told me. Oh, you're a B class shooter. Oh, okay. So I know that you're a good shooter. Maybe you're not the fastest, but you're fast enough to have reached that level. And that can tell me a lot about your abilities. Right.
Which, this is probably a good segue in how do you even get signed up? So, when you said, okay, go seek something out to, go sign up for something. Okay, so where do you find it? I know you have Practice Score for some stuff. I don't know. Admittedly, I don't know if that covers all of the organizations. So talk to us a little bit about where do you go?
Right, and so I'm glad that you brought up Practice Score because that basically is the centralized location these days. Right, so you can find some competitions outside of Practice Score, but back in the day, you kind of just had to know where the shooting clubs were in your region, and then either reach out to them, go to their website, meet somebody there, and get signed up. Well, nowadays, everything essentially is under Practice Score. So PracticeScore.com. It's not the easiest website to navigate. But in my video that I made about it, I do kind of go through a quick tutorial. So if you need a reference, that's there for you. But at the same time, if you've got some patience and you can click through all the different tabs and figure out how the search engine works, it's as simple as going on that website, using its search engine, telling it where you are and what shooting sport you're looking for. And it'll show you, here's all the different clubs within whatever your search radius is, 100 miles, 200 miles, that are happening in the near future. And then it's just a matter of clicking on the link and filling out your information and submitting it and getting approved to go to the match, which, they're not going to typically ask you for a lot of credentials, right? They are open to the public most of the time. Some clubs do their own private matches, but you'll show up to a shooting range after you've signed up on Practice Score, and maybe you don't know what division you're in, and they'll probably have you fill out a waiver, ask you some questions, and then based on your skill level, they're going to provide you the supplemental information that you need to be safe. They'll go over the safety rules with you. They'll tell you where you're allowed to handle your weapon safely, what areas you can't. Typically, they'll tell you, most competitions I go to, your gun is unloaded unless you're in the act of running through a stage. And they'll have designated areas where you can work on your firearm if you need to adjust things. and they'll kind of tell you like when is it safe and appropriate to reload magazines, things like that. So practicescore.com is your go-to. You can also look at the website specifically for the governing bodies of these different competition organizations and get more information there. So like USPSA has its own website. Steel Challenge, which is actually under the governing body of USPSA, has its own website. And then PCSL, etc. Like all of these, IDPA is another one. I'm not sure if they have their own website. I'm not a huge fan of IDPA, and if we want to talk about why, we can. But hey, that's just me. Like if you're out there and IDPA is what's going on in your community, do it. We're really lucky living in New England because where we live, there's basically a competition happening every weekend somewhere in driving distance from the months of like late March to late November. There are other parts of the country where, you might have one club that's 2-3 hours away. So you get one competition a month if you're willing to make the drive, right? Mm-hmm. But if it exists, chances are it's on PracticeScore, unless this club is not looking for people in the community to join them. But the vast majority of them are. I've yet to meet someone who says that they just don't have any clubs in their area. Maybe if you live in like rural Nebraska. But even those guys, like I know people out there that they'll drive 5 hours to go to a competition, so they exist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So we've gotten into where to go. So let's say somebody signs up. They're signed up. They paid whatever they're $10, $15, $25. PracticeScore. Hey, they've got a competition. What are the things that they need aside from their firearm to bring to that competition? Right, so probably a gun belt, right? Holster, magazine. So if you were to advise a brand new shooter who says, "Hey, Tyler, I just signed up on PracticeScore," and by the way, we will drop Tyler's link to his video on how to get started on Steel Challenge and PracticeScore in the description of this episode. So you guys don't have to go search for it. It'll be in the description of the episode, so all that will be available. But just so, Tyler, newbie, just signed up. What do they need to get?
Okay, so you come to me, you ask me what equipment that you need. It's going to be dependent on what type of competition you're doing to a degree. The basics that you're pretty much always going to need if you're going to be competing in some type of practical pistol competition, whether it be USPSA, PCL, you definitely need a holster and a gun belt. You're going to need more than one magazine. If you're shooting Steel Challenge, ideally you're going to have 5 magazines because you're shooting each stage 5 times, and you don't want to be the person who's reloading their magazines between each string. USPSA, I would say 3 magazines should get you through most, unless you're someone carrying your micro carry pistol that only has 10 rounds. You might need a little bit more.
Or if you're magazine restricted and if you live in a different state.
Yeah, or if you live in a magazine restricted state, or you shoot single stack because you're a boomer and you love single stack 1911s, like whatever your deal is, right? Like you may need a few extra magazines. But what I would say is the bare minimum is eye and ear protection, a belt, magazines, mag pouches, holster, and your gun. And, as you continue to compete, that's going to grow, right? I showed up to my first match with my gun belt on me. It wasn't a competition style gun belt. A lot of people see these like higher end competitive shooters have all this fancy gear that doesn't look very practical. And that's because it's built for speed and it's built for the competition specifically. But if you show up with your tactical rig and your level 3 retention holster and, you've got your med kit on it and your dump pouch and all that stuff, like maybe there's someone who's going to point out that like, hey, by the way, like this may not be regulation for your division, but no one's going to stop you. Mm-hmm. They might just tell you like, hey, just at a certain point, like if you get into this more, you may need to adapt your gear to be more competitive, but otherwise you can shoot with the equipment you have. Mm-hmm. And eventually, like you may want to bring some spare parts and some, make sure that your gun's lubed and like, maybe bring some snacks because you're going to be there all day. And like eventually it turns into you walking around with a cart full of gear and ammo.
Oh my gosh, this was hilarious. So my first match down at SIG, I I just had I had my range bag and my ammo can, right? I was ready to go. I saw everybody had either a baby stroller cart or one of those pull along wagons that you see people at the beach. I was like, what? Why does everybody have a what? It made no sense to me. An hour into it, made perfect sense. I am hauling all my gear all day, and when he said all day, yeah, it was a hefty part. I think we started. It was either 8 or 9 o'clock or something like that, and it went till probably about 2-ish. So yeah, I mean some places will give you lunch, or other places will give you time for lunch, so you can you can get something. But yeah, you're there for 5-6 hours. But yeah, you're gonna that day I was like, that's going on my list to get a little wagon. Yeah. I do not want to be carrying my stuff.
Costco.
Your arms hurt, your shoulder hurt, all that kind of stuff.
Costco, $89 for the collapsible wagon, and it is like the XL wagon. So and with the big wheels. So shout out right there.
Yeah, you're gonna find the guy that's there with his umbrella and his his camping chair, his fold-out chair, and everything, and you're going to realize really quickly, like, oh yeah, maybe I should have at least brought some sunscreen. But yeah, the entry is really simple. As long as you have those basic pieces of equipment, you can compete. So don't overthink the gear. Don't think that you need to go out and buy some fancy race holster and competition belt right off the rip. I shot my first whole season with gear that I already had before I started investing in competition-oriented gear.
And I think it was very similar to me too. And I remember reaching out to you back, it might have been approaching a year ago now. I was like, yeah, my battle belt is not going to be conducive to this environment, Tyler. I need a little bit of guidance, and I talked to our buddy Tim as well, and just trying to see different perspectives and all that. And it was similar. It was just like, oh, this company versus this company, but it was like, yeah, you want this type of belt, this type of mag holder, this type of pistol holster, excuse me. But yeah, it was very funny. Like, yeah, very similar just experiences.
Right. You're just going a little deeper down the rabbit hole, because if you've gotten into shooting in general, which brand is best for this, and like, who should I be looking at for this type of piece of equipment? Now you're just doing it again for a much more niche part of the shooting community. Is like, okay, well, what about these communities, these companies that are specifically geared towards competition? Right. You're just doing the same dance over again, but on a deeper level. Now, and I do want to preface something that you said was, you realized at a certain point your tactical gear wasn't going to work for you in the long run, and you wanted to switch to competition gear. I'll tell people right now, there's a chance that you'll get the competition bug and you just want to get better at competition for the sake of competition. That's where the competitive gear comes into play. But if you're doing this purely for training, and you spend your entire, quote unquote, competition shooting experience or journey using that tactical gear, that's totally fine. There's plenty of people that do that.
Yeah, that's fair.
You see a lot of law enforcement who, maybe they only show up to a competition once or twice a year, and they're wearing their duty belt just because they want to get those reps in. Totally fine, And again, this goes back to what we were saying earlier. The competition is against yourself, regardless of where your ego is. And you're thinking, oh, I should be higher on the leaderboard. It's like, well, are you higher relative to how you did last time you did this? And if you did, then that's a win in my book. So, don't get intimidated by the fact that there's people out there with these guns that look like they're out of a Star Trek episode. And their holster consists of a latch that holds the trigger guard and nothing else. And they're wearing the yellow glasses and the knee-high socks. And they look, the more you get into competition, the nerdier you look.
Oh, 100%.
Let's be real about it. It's not sexy when you get to that high-end level. But
don't forget the glasses with the cameras and the hat with the cameras and all of that stuff where they're recording themselves, and it's insane how much stuff. It's like watching the Olympics shooters with all of their stuff that they've got going, and then they can rewatch their performance ad nauseum, which is hilarious.
So, Marvin, that's a really good point, because for the longest time, probably about a year, I didn't think anything of like, why are these people recording? Again, it's the whole thing with the carts and the baby strollers all over again. It's like, why are these people wearing GoPros on their hats? It's like, I was like, okay, let me just think about this for a second. And I was talking to people and it's like, oh yeah, I want to review my footage. I want to see, how did I do? How was my draw? And then you can kind of get that third person view of see if a friend recording you as well. And you can see, okay, how was my foot movement? How was my I think I said my draw already, but then you can see like from that first person view, how was my target transition? So it makes sense. Like
Right.
if you're trying to do, like Tyler, what you said, if you're trying to do, like, I want to improve myself, I'm trying to be better than I was yesterday in competition shooting.
Yep.
Like, yeah, you're going to want to probably invest in something like that so that you can use that data, and data's great. But
Right.
for the new shooter, of course, that's not our, advising, to right off the bat. Again, like, you don't need to go drop $3,000 on all this accessory stuff that doesn't matter when you're just going to your first competition.
Right.
Like it depends on what's your why of why do you want to go to these matches. If it's to like you and I and all of us that have gotten that competition bug, it's like, yeah, I want to be better. And if you're in our group chat, then it's like, yeah, I want to be better than Tyler, which we'll see if that ever happens. But yeah, we healthy competition between us. But yeah, if you're just wanting to do it for fun and be better than you were yesterday, then you might not need to invest in all this stuff. And we like to push each other, so that's a little bit different.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. I experienced something similar initially when I saw people with these cameras on their hats and filming each other. I thought it was an ego thing because let's be honest, like competition shooting videos are kind of neat to watch.
They're really cool.
Yeah. And when I tell people who aren't in the shooting community what I do as a hobby, usually the one thing they'll equate it to in their mind is they're like, oh, like John Wick, that kind of shooting. And I go, and like in my mind, I'm like, yeah. But then like I think about it and I'm like, not really. Like it's not nearly as cool looking, but I'm going to let you say that and I'm going to go along with it because it sounds really cool. But you think it's an ego thing, and then you get into the sport and you realize, oh, it's the fact that the type of competition we have, you're fighting for tenths of a second. And it's almost imperceptible to the human eye. And that's why competition shooting's never really become a spectator sport. There's been attempts in the past to like televise it, but really it's tough because it's really difficult when you have two grandmaster level shooters competing against each other without being able to see the time and the scores immediately, who actually did better. Because at the end of the stage, you're going to realize that one of them beat the other by maybe one alpha versus a Charlie shot on target and maybe a tenth of a second, right? So the cameras really are just so you can go back and say, well, where could I have been more... where could I economized time? Where could I have been more mechanically efficient in my movements? And you start to get into this really analytical way of looking at it, which, ultimately I think is really important, right? If you think about the history of like the art of combat or the art of self-defense, if you could have given knights in the medieval age cameras so they could watch their duels, they would, because it's the same concept. It's like, well, if I had been a tenth of a second faster on this parry, maybe I would have won that bout.
Like fencing kind of.
Like fencing.
Yeah.
Great point. Yeah, exactly. Like fencing. So like, fencing's evolved to now like you have sensors within the suit that pick up like who touched who first. And it's very controlled. And it's very similar in that way in competition shooting. So everything has a purpose, which is kind of why it does look as, like Marvin said, kind of ridiculous when you watch those Olympic shooters with their fancy glasses and their fancy wrist braces and these pistols that don't look practical at all. And all of that is to economize ergonomics and speed and like ease and efficiency. So yeah, when it comes to the equipment, don't be intimidated. Bring what you have. And then it really is just a process of learning as you go. Let's just kind of talk about some of the basics of things like scoring, classification, things like that, so the listeners finally understand what a master class or grandmaster class shooter means.
And then you said Alpha and Charlie. I was like, oh, we gotta.
We don't even know what those are.
We don't
yet.
know what is that. What do you talk about?
Okay, so the way scoring works in a USPSA competition, you have sanctioned targets that are designed by the organization that have different scoring areas within them. The center area, which is the smallest, is the alpha zone. The area surrounding that is a Charlie zone, and then the area surrounding that is a delta zone. So the way scoring typically will work, unless it's specified differently per stage, is 2 shots on target, and the combination of where your targets land is going to be your score for that target. So 2 shots in the alpha zone are going to be 5 points each. So there's a maximum of 10 points for that target. Depending on whether or not, see, I don't want to go too deep into this, but I'm about to say power factor.
Yeah, don't.
We're not going to get into power factor. Don't worry about that for right now. You can do the nerd stuff later. But depending on your power factor, a Charlie's going to either be 4 or 3 points. So for the sake of this, we'll just say it's 3, and then a delta is going to be 1 point. And so you'll combine those points. So say you got an alpha delta, that's 5 plus 1, so now you have 6 points for that target. You're going to add up all of your points for all of the targets engaged. You're going to take that number and you're going to divide it by the total time that it took you to engage all of those targets. And what you get from that is points per second, or what's known in the sport as hit factor. Right? So it's an equation of points divided by time, right? So points per second is, you'll end up getting something like a 10.47. And what that means is you got 10.4 points per second. If that makes sense. The math is mathing. But yeah, so that's how the scoring works. And then there's like more rules that go on to that. Sometimes you'll have targets that you're not supposed to shoot. And we mentioned the term no-shoot earlier. I think Marvin mentioned it. That's what a no-shoot is you'll have a target where maybe it's the target you're intending to shoot, and then slightly offset from that is a no-shoot target to simulate like, oh, there's a hostage situation, and this person's using another person as a shield, and making sure that you don't shoot the no-shoot target and engage the target you intend to hit. Things like that. You'll have targets that are partially covered where the scoring area is omitted, so you'll have half a target that's like a different color.
I was just going to say, yeah, people might ask, well, how do you tell what target is a no-shoot versus not? So there's color differentiations between targets, and each of the sport will, so USPSA and PCSL, they use different colors to indicate which are shootable targets and which are no-shoot targets.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And then, if you get into like things like 2-gun, 3-gun, it becomes more complicated.
Right,
but you can learn those as you go.
Yep.
And then, so once you have your score, well, how do you determine your classification? So classification in USPSA is broken down into, you have Grandmaster, which is the top classification. Then you have Master Class, which is just below that. Then you have Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. And what they are is, think about like in school when you were graded on a curve, and the highest scoring student got 100%, and then everybody else's score was based on that one. Very similar concept. So you'll have a given stage, and the classifications are broken down by basically what are the grandmasters, the established grandmasters shooting at. The top 0.01% of shooters in the sport are getting this score, and then they will take an aggregate of scores from shooters across the country, and then they determine the percentages based on that. So a grandmaster, to classify as a grandmaster, you have to be shooting hit factors, so points and time combined have to equal 95% or better of what the top shooters are shooting. And then you have master class, which I wish I wrote this down. I think it's between 85 and 95%. Alpha's 75 to 85. I want to say B class is like 60 to 75. And they get a little bit larger where I think once you get to D class, you're below 40%.
Yeah, I just pulled it up, so not to be actually. So yeah, GM Grandmaster 95 to 100, Master 85 to 95, Alpha 75 to 85.
Okay.
Bravo 60 to 75.
Yeah, a little bit bigger there.
A little bit bigger there, and then Charlie 40 to 60.
Yep.
And then Delta 0 to 40.
0 to
so,
40.
You know,
Yeah, so it's a little bit on a curve there.
Yeah. Yep.
And what I mean by percentage, again, just to really clear this up, is you take the highest hit factors for that stage, and if you shot the stage in a time with the amount of points that's equal to 40% of that hit factor, that puts you right on the edge between Delta and Charlie. So basically, in USPSA, unlike Steel Challenge, in USPSA, you have specific stages that are standardized across the sport that are used to determine your classification. So not every stage that you see at a USPSA match are going to lead towards you getting a classification, but they'll have these stages that the governing body has agreed, these are what we're going to use to determine skill level. Typically, they're simpler stages, so they're easier to set up, and they can be used, kind of universally across gun ranges. And they're trying to test your skill level. So some classifier stages will have you do specific things. Like you kind of mentioned earlier, you had a stage where you had to shoot, freestyle, meaning both hands, an array of targets, then perform a reload, and then shoot strong hand only, and then do the same thing, but then weak hand only. So they're testing you on your ability to do a reload under time, to engage the targets as fast as you can, and to do it with both dominant and non-dominant hands only, right? And so basically they're trying to do their best to get a general understanding of, like, someone at this skill level should be able to do these things at this speed with this degree of accuracy. And that's what's going to get you those classifications. There's about 40,000 USPSA members in the country. And of them, the amount of GMs is somewhere roughly at like 1.5% of that, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
So if you do make it, if you meet someone who's a GM shooter, chances are they're really, really good.
It's between 400 and 600 people.
Something like that.
Out, assuming assuming those numbers, and I'm not going to, try and find
right,
that
don't
number.
quote
but
me on it.
Yeah. But assuming, call it 40,000, and assuming, top 1.5%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So out of the people who actually shoot competitions, out of those people, between 400 and 600 people are GMs.
Right. And I mean, it's different sport to sport, right?
For USPSA.
Before USPSA.
And
yeah.
that's,
Yeah, because I know Steel Challenge uses the same classification system.
Okay.
But the numbers are going to be a little bit different.
Sure.
Right. And that has to do with the amount of traffic, right? So you have people shooting different divisions, so that number might be a little higher, a little lower, depending on the division. Let's talk about divisions for a second, because we did talk about equipment already. When it comes to divisions, I would tell you first, don't sweat it. I just want to give you a taste of it so you kind of know what's going to happen going forward. You don't need to know what division you fall into when you go to your first match. But eventually you'll want to know what division you fall into if you want to be more competitive, because you want to have division gear, that is to regulation for that division. So to make the sport equitable, there are divisions broken down by equipment type. Right? So it's not necessarily fair if you want to shoot a revolver that you're going to be scored against someone who has a semi-automatic handgun that has a single action trigger. It's got a comp on it, or it's got a muzzle device that reduces recoil. Okay. Right. I can keep this simple, right? And then
newer shooters.
Shooter. Yeah. Yep. Well, you'll get into all the fancy upgrades that you can make, but a highly upgraded gun versus someone who's shooting maybe iron sights, or like a revolver, or their ammo is restricted, to like it's a single stack or it's limited capacity. It's not equitable for those people all to be competing against each other. So they break them down into divisions. Open division, being the broadest, is going to have all the race guns, right? People are just going to soup up the perfect gun for that division. The founder of IPSC way back in the day wanted to have the concept behind the divisions was they wanted to see what innovations in firearm technology can competition shooting produce.
That's actually kind of cool.
Yeah, and they thought that they were going to create these, like, eventually people would create these ideas that made better guns for combat. What ended up happening is they just made better guns for competition. and so they're really unpractical. And they're not something that you would see like a Navy SEAL or a Ranger carrying, because they're just not as reliable. You kind of have to baby them, keep them clean. But they're really great for what they do, which is shooting really fast in a controlled environment. Then you have my division, for instance, just an example, Carry Optics. Carry Optics division is designed for people that have production-style handguns while also incorporating a slide-mounted optic. And by production, I mean you buy it from the factory, you don't modify it to the extreme of like putting fancy muzzle devices on it, or, you know, cutting like holes in the slide to lighten it up, or porting the barrel, or all these fancy things that like don't really matter for the point of this conversation. But it's a gun you get from the factory, you put an optic on it, that's Carry Optics. Production division, to even go further in explaining that, is guns from the factory, right? Like, a good example is a P320, you pull it out of the box from SIG, or a Walther PDP, you pull it out of the box, that's a production gun. Once you start modifying it, you know, depending on the type of modifications, you're going to start moving into a different division. You have revolver division, you have single stack division, you have limited optics now, which is we're allowing more modifications but not quite going to open division. And then you have the cheater division, as I like to call it, which is the PCC division, that's pistol caliber carbines. So there are some people out there who have the audacity to take a rifle to a pistol competition and think they're equals. So we don't consider them real. I'm joking, by the way, but we don't consider them real competitors. So, but just an idea, if you have a type of gun that you're really partial to and you want to compete with it, there's probably a division that you can fall into. And what makes that exciting is you get to see where you rank up against other shooters shooting similar equipment.
And it's also not like you have to start at, say you somehow fell into one of those really nice guns that Tyler was talking about. It's not like you have to be like, oh, well, I can't shoot that yet because I haven't done my first match. You know, I'm going to go buy, you know, a P320 or a Glock 19 or Walther PDP or something like that so that I can shoot production and then work my way up. Now, theoretically, would you want to do that just from a, how do I learn how to manipulate a firearm? Probably, but you don't have to, like Tyler said and Marvin said already, it's like you use your gear that you have. So whatever you bought, whatever you have, if you have a red dot, or, you know, shoot in Carry Optics or limited optics, depending on what the rules are saying. But it's not like, oh, I have to start in production, then I can work my way up to Carry Optics, then I can work my way up into limited optics, then I can work my way up to open. So no,
I've seen people shoot USPSA matches with, you know, their subcompact or micro carry guns, and they're totally outclassed by everyone else around them, but they're there to train and have fun, and that's totally okay too. So I mean, you know, if you just show up and you ask them, hey, what division I'm in, someone will be able to tell you, and chances are they might just throw you an open your first time. And then once you understand the nuances of the different divisions, if you want to then go out and get a competition-specific gun or build one to a division that you think is really interesting, you can do that at that point. You know, Carry Optics, for example, that is the big division right now because of its accessibility. Almost everyone these days who's getting into firearms is buying a handgun with an optic. I'm, you know, not to get into the training side of things, like, oh, should you have iron sights versus optics? I don't think that's really important, but a lot of people will tell you, if you don't have an optic these days, you're living in the Stone Age, you know? So like a lot of people are just getting optics right out of the gate. And so that's what makes that division so popular. But there are those people that like still just want to become crazy good with a revolver, you know? So when they go to a competition, it's them and maybe two other guys that are in their division, but they don't care because they just want to get really good with the gun that they care about or the gun that they think is the most fun to compete with.
And then you have our Marvin. I don't know if you know this about Tim, but he's I think he said he wants to get a classification in every division. I'm like, wow, that's dedication, because you have to shoot all those matches for all of the divisions. I'm like, wow, okay.
Yeah.
Good for you.
I've got some friends that I've met through competition shooting that are at that degree, especially in Steel Challenge, is they'll have a gun for each division. And they'll focus a season or two trying to get to the GM class or master class with that one. And then they move on to something else. And I've even done that. I've dabbled a little bit myself. So I started in carry optics in USPSA. And then last year I bought a gun that put me into limited optics. And, to give you an idea of the difference in nuances, very similar, but limited optics allows me to have a flared magwell. And it also allows me to shoot single action only pistols. So you think your 1911 style or 2011 style pistols where you carry it with the hammer cocked and there's no, extensive double action break, which I'm sure you guys touched on in your first episode.
I think a little bit, but just in case
to explain that if you're not sure the difference, single action essentially means that there's no cocking of the firearm during the press of the trigger. So the cocking mechanism, in this case it's a hammer, is already cocked back and ready to fire once you take the weapon off safe. And the reason that puts me in a different division is it's a much lighter trigger press and it's very, very crisp. So compared to someone using a carry gun, maybe it's a double action where as you're pulling the trigger, it's cocking the hammer, or it's a striker fire, which is going to have a heavier trigger out of the box. I have a little bit of a mechanical advantage against them because I have this very nice, crisp and short trigger press.
And then you have double action, single action, which has that first heavier pull, and then it goes to that single action that you're talking. So you have one extreme, you have middle, then you have the other extreme.
Yeah, further down the rabbit hole.
Again,
it gets fun.
Right.
Eventually, once it stops being overwhelming, it starts being fun.
Yeah.
But
so I want to circle back real quick to what you were talking about before about people who take their carry guns, because I shoot the competitions with my carry gun, right? So my goal is to go and get better with my carry gun, get that muscle memory in, get those reps in. And I think, and the competition piece is interesting to me. And I, as we were talking just before we started recording, I do have a bit of a race gun that, it's got a ported barrel. It's got, a light on it. It's got a red dot. It's got lightning cuts on it, all that fun stuff. But I think for a lot of folks who are out there listening, probably the number one thing would be for them to take their carry gun and use that as opposed to looking at, hey, I'm going to go drop $2,000 on like a CZ Shadow 2 or something crazy like that and mod it out, put a new trigger in it, put a charging handle on it and all of those fun things. So with all of that being said, because you guys were just talking about single action, double action, is how many people do you encounter, Tyler, when you're going out and shooting that are taking that approach? Is it like 25% of the folks out there? Is it like 50% of the folks out there? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the people that are running like a carry gun at a USPSA competition, they're typically the minority, but they exist. And you will see people who maybe they do have a race gun, but like kind of similar to you, it's, well, I want to get the repetitions with my carry gun in, so I'm going to run that for a few matches to make sure that the muscle memory's there, that I'm manipulating the gun as well as I am my competition pistol. But what I would tell you from my experience, and part of this is like coming from the instructor side of things, is that if you're going to compete, it is good to have a competition pistol if you're going to go down the rabbit hole. And the only reason I say that is someone like us who got into competition and got the bug and continue to compete regularly, we're shooting a lot more ammo than your typical hobbyist gun owner, right? So, maybe if you're currently someone who goes to the range and shoots 100 rounds once a month, becoming a competition shooter, you're potentially shooting 200, 250 rounds a weekend, multiple times a month. And the wear and tear that that's going to put on your gun over time, having a gun that's dedicated to that abuse that you're not trusting your life with is really beneficial. So I've had a gun break on me, not catastrophically, mind you, but it broke from the wear and tear. My P320 that I used to compete with, my FCU, a crucial part ended up breaking during training for competition. And, this was at like the 60,000 round level. So, that kind of, I wouldn't trust my life with that gun because of the amount of abuse that I provided on a weekly basis. And so, I would say that if you want to get to that level and you're ready to start competing regularly, having a dedicated gun is good for that reason. And the other thing I would tell you too is that learning to become proficient on a full-size handgun is just going to be easier than your carry gun. The larger the handgun, the easier it's going to be to manipulate, right? To a degree. It can't be too big for your hands, but a full-size gun, you're going to be more accurate. You're going to have an easier time controlling the gun. And so those skills will translate over. I became a more accurate shot with my carry gun because I shot my full-size gun more frequently through competition. And then, once I came back to my carry gun and went and shot it at the range, I noticed improvement. And it wasn't from shooting that gun repetitiously. It was from honing those skills in on a different platform and then applying the same things that I learned to my everyday carry gun.
Gotcha. And I think that's a fantastic point. And honestly, if anybody out there is looking at getting into competition seriously, absolutely. I think from where I also want to approach it is just to make sure that those folks who are out there who probably can't afford to buy a second handgun or buy a dedicated or a race gun for competition, right? Not to be scared off by any of that. I mean, if you can't go out and buy a multi-$1,000 handgun, you're probably not going to be spending enough on ammo to wear out your carry gun, but it still would be a great avenue for somebody who is looking to get some repetition in, looking to push themselves, and do it in a supportive environment. Like you said, Tyler, a lot of these clubs are very welcoming. They're looking to bring more people into the sport, to not be scared off and say, hey, I can't get into competition shooting because I don't have a dedicated gun, or I can't do the things that I think are necessary. To your point, right? Using the gear that you have and not having to go out and buy specialized gear, because all of that is expensive. And so, want to just make sure that we're bringing this back to those new gun owners who may not be able to afford all of that. And, hey, I can only afford to buy one gun, but I need to get good with it.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad that you reframed that or kind of brought it back to center, because that is important for people to understand. Like, look, if you're going to go out and shoot a competition maybe once or twice a year, I mean, that's totally okay to use the gun that you're carrying every day. I mean, make sure that you're maintaining it well, make sure that you clean it. But typically, your carry gun is going to be built to be a workhorse, right? Like, I carry a Smith & Wesson Shield Plus, and I'm partial to them because I carried the Shield 2.0 before that, and it was an absolute workhorse. Pulled it out of the box, never lubed it up, shot 500 rounds through it without a malfunction. Like, it just spits ammo. Like, it doesn't matter the quality of it. Like, it's gonna perform that way. Glocks are the same way, right? And typically your guns that are built for carry specifically are going to have that kind of I don't want to say under-engineered, but they're built to just work, right? They're not going to be the most accurate gun. Maybe they're not the most balanced gun. They're not those $3,000 race guns that we're talking about, but they're going to get the job done. So going and shooting some competitions with it isn't going to hurt it. It's really once you get into that, oh, I'm going to take this seriously because, maybe you're like us and caught the bug. Like I was saying in the beginning, at first there was a point to this for me, which was to become more proficient so that it translated to be a better instructor. Then I stopped wanting to pursue instruction, and I realized I'm just doing this purely for the thrill of the sport because I'm addicted now. It's super fun. I'm a highly competitive person, and I just want to be better. And at that point, you do need to start thinking about like, okay, I have to have dedicated equipment to this because I'm going to be abusing it. I'm going to be putting it through its paces.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So, I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot of stuff. Is there anything in your guys' mind that a new shooter would still be wondering, like what questions would they have? We can talk about like what to expect at a match. I don't think we've really covered that yet.
Yeah, like we talked about the people, and that, honestly, to me, the people piece of it is such a huge thing. Like, if you're doing something and you don't enjoy the people that you're around, then that sucks, right?
That's true.
So I haven't found anybody at any of the matches that I've been at that I'm like, yeah, I don't want to talk to you. Like, everybody is like, I want to talk to them. And so to me personally, that's the biggest part. Like, I enjoy being at these places with the people that are also there. So, but when you get into the, maybe, gear or technical piece, yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about, what do you need to bring as from an equipment perspective. Good. Talked a little bit of, the stages, but okay, maybe, we don't have to go through like the commands and all that. That's a little bit, maybe too deep that they'll learn at the match. But yeah, maybe it's a little bit about, okay, you have 125 people at this thing. Where do I go? Like, what does this look like?
Yeah. Yeah, let's definitely touch on community, because like the competition shooting community is extremely unique. And obviously I'm biased, but I'm really glad that you brought it up because I love talking about it. I have never met a group of people that are more welcoming, friendly, and willing to help you that you're actively competing against, right? I mean, I would even say that like I would put it on par with going to a really welcoming church. And I say that because I've been to churches where like people don't give you the time of day, which is kind of a bummer. But like, there's this degree of like, oh, you're new. You're a new guy. Okay, let me explain everything that I know to you because I'm really excited that you're here.
Right.
That kind of attitude exists, and it'll throw you off at first.
Especially in New England, because it's like, why are you talking to me?
Yeah. The New England culture's a very polite culture, but very reserved.
Yep.
Like, I'm not just going to tell you my life story, but if you go to a shooting competition and you tell someone you're new, they're going to stop whatever they're doing and explain to you for 20 minutes why they love this sport and like make sure you know all the rules. And then, one thing that's really interesting is even when you get to that higher competitive level, like among masterclass shooters, we'll be shooting and then, maybe you go and perform a stage and you come off that stage and, this person might tell you like, hey, by the way, be really aware of this target. I didn't see it from this area. Or, like, hey, when you take this turn right here, like it's going to be sharper than you think and you need to really shift your weight. And like giving each other these tips where it's like, we're actively competing against each other. I don't know why you're helping me.
But thanks.
But thank you. And it's all sincere because people care more about let's all get better together than anything else. And then you also have to remember this has to be a high trust community because you're showing up to an event with, sometimes up to 100, and sometimes it goes up to like 300, 400 people, right? Some of these larger events can get really big, but like your typical match, you might have 40 to 100 people. And a lot of them are strangers. And if you're new, they're all strangers to you, but they're all carrying firearms. They're all running around at really high speeds with firearms, but it's very, very safe because it's very controlled. I became a certified range officer through USPSA so I could help run matches. And one of the things my instructor told our class was that, I knock on wood, before I say this, but he said that no one's ever died at a USPSA competition. And the reason for that is because of how safe they make them. And you'll hear new shooters complain. They're like, oh my God, there's so many rules. Like we mentioned earlier, this rule book is huge. And it's like, you know, like you mentioned range commands, like there's certain things you can't do until you're told to do them, but they all serve that purpose of keeping it safe and keeping it fun. So that way everyone can be relaxed around people that they don't know. Is this person even capable of doing this safely? Like they make sure that they're eliminating all of those unknown variables. So I've made tons of friends through competition shooting. If you start showing up to them more frequently, people know your name, and sometimes you haven't even introduced yourself. They'll just be like, oh, you're Tyler. Oh yeah, I saw you on the leaderboard. Like, okay, yeah, like I know where you are.
Right.
You know, and I've got a friend in Steel Challenge who like he's become my like quote unquote like arch rival.
Okay.
But in a really friendly way.
Yeah.
Like he'll shoot the same competition maybe a day before me, and I'll see his scores.
Then you're like, I got it.
And I'll see him the next day and be like, hey, I'm coming for you.
Yeah.
Like I know I got your name, I got your number. So like, you know, but it's all in a spirit of we're all trying to get better. And at the end of the day, I would rather lose and have fun than win and like have everybody hate me because I'm a bad sport. And I think that's really I've never experienced that to that degree anywhere else.
Yeah.
So the community is really amazing, and I can't stress that enough. But to get back to the point or the question that you had was like, what do you expect at a competition? So you've signed up for a competition. You've located the gun range. You show up there the morning of. You know, you're going to find an area where everybody's parked. Everyone's kind of getting their gear out, checking equipment. They're going to have a briefing maybe 15 minutes before the match starts to go over club-specific rules, let you know where everything is, what order you're going in, what squad you're going to be in. So, you know, just to explain that, think of it like a golf course. You have different holes, and you're all kind of going in like a carousel fashion around to these different locations to shoot each hole. Well, in a shooting competition, you're going to have the same thing. You might have like 6 stages at a club, and they're all in different bays, and you're going to be teamed up with anywhere from like maybe a handful to maybe a dozen people who you're going to be shooting each stage with. And then they'll determine all of that at the briefing. Then you go and you link up with your squad, which are going to be at the stage that you're going to start the day at. So, you know, maybe you're not starting on stage 1. Maybe you're starting on stage 5, right? You'll meet everybody, do a roll call, make sure that everybody understands what's going on. Then they'll go over, this is the stage that you're shooting. They'll give you any stage-specific rules. They'll tell you how many targets there are. And you'll have the ability to walk the stage to get familiar with it, so you're not just going into it blind, right? And that is part of the strategy we were talking earlier. It's like, okay, well, what order do I want to shoot these in? And how many targets are there? Do I need to perform a reload, etc.? And then they will go down the list, and everybody else is going to be like standing by, watching each person shoot. We're all going to help reset the stage for each new shooter. They're going to get scores, and then you'll move on to the next stage collectively. There's a lot of downtime between shooting at competitions, so there's a lot of chatter going on. So that's really kind of part of where the community gets built, is just talking to people about, well, what do you think I should do on this stage? Or like, you know, even just like, how often do you compete? That's one of the most common questions. You know, it's like, what's your classification? How often have you done this? And then like kind of that's where you start to find out who your peer group is. And then you start making connections that way. But it really is that simple. It seems intimidating from the outside because it's a new location and you don't want to like step on anyone's toes. You will occasionally get the person who shows up and doesn't know etiquette, right? So they show up with a gun on their hip already loaded. Usually it's not the end of the world. Usually like during that morning briefing, they're gonna ask, is anyone carrying a loaded gun right now? You'll raise your hand and they're like, all right, well, come see me after this. We'll get you safely downloaded, you know, and then you're only going to load and make ready per stage, right? Things like that.
Yeah, it's not like you automatically get a DQ because you had your, you know, carry rig on you, and then, you know, it's like, nope, go home. It's like, no.
Let's talk about DQs. Yeah, since you brought it up. Everybody DQs at some point.
Everybody DQs.
I just want to say that, but when we say DQ, we mean disqualification. And this goes back to the safety aspect, right? So there's a lot of rules on things that you can do that are, unsafe that can cause a disqualification. The most obvious one that comes to mind is what's known as the 180 rule.
Now let's before just because what we say is unsafe, it's not that anybody is immediately put into danger.
Right. Yeah,
so,
that's a good point.
So I just want to make that clear. It's not like anybody is at risk, or it's just the terminology of making sure that everything is held to a safe standard.
Right. When you go to a retail range or when you go to a gun club range and you're shooting, on a flat range, they're going to have a list of rules, right? They're going to tell you like these are what you can and can't do, and it's the same concept, but it's geared towards an environment where dynamic shooting is taking place, right? So for instance, typically your shooting bay is going to have 3 berms, right? So it's open on one end, and you never want to point your gun up range, right? At any range. Well, especially at a competition like this. And it's very important because of the dynamic movements taking place. Sometimes you might have to run backwards or laterally with a loaded firearm in your hand. And so the 180 rule is this idea that if you are in a position where maybe you have to turn and run up range to engage a different target, you're not turning your gun and breaking this 180 degree line that separates uprange from downrange, right? And so to your point, you could break the 180 just barely on a turn going up range. I know a couple people that have done that, and
he may or may not be sitting in the room.
Who may or may not be sitting in the room with us. And it's not necessarily quote unquote unsafe because like the gun wasn't pointed at anyone. It was still pointed at the berm. Like, the shooter in question knew exactly where the gun was pointed. It just so happens that he slightly broke that 180.
It was like 180.1 degrees.
0.1. Yeah. Just barely over. But that rule's in place because we don't want to introduce that degree of risk. Mm-hmm. So you could face a disqualification from a match for doing that, and it's not the end of the world, right?
It hurts initially.
I've been disqualified twice in the 3 years that I've been shooting. Both times I took it like a champ, and I understood that it's like, look, nobody was in harm's way, but I violated one of the rules, and what that ends up meaning is that you're done for the day. Your scores are not going to get tallied, and you're not going to show up on the leaderboard, but you're welcome back.
Right.
And like a good range officer at a match, and your squad mates are going to be really supportive when this happens. I was told, they're like, look, man, I'm sorry. Like, rules are rules. And like, even though nobody was in danger, like, we have to enforce this rule. And they're like, you can stay. We would love it if you stay and like hang out with us the rest of the day. And it's very important to them that they know it's like, hey, please come back.
Yeah.
Like, please come try this again. Mm-hmm. So if you do find yourself in a state of anxiety at your first match, thinking like, well, I don't want to break any rules. I don't want anyone to yell at me. Like, as long as you have like this fundamental degree of safety that we've talked about, like, can you do these things safely? Mm-hmm. And you're not a liability to yourself or others, like, you're going to be okay.
Well, and then one of our buddies, I won't name drop, but one of our buddies in our chat, he I think it was, he broke the 180. And he was like, I'm going to go home and do squats and deadlifts until I throw up. I hate my life.
He's going to haze himself. Yeah, and it is kind of a bummer when that happens, but again, it is about that safety. So like, just don't feel pressured when you go to your first match. And also, don't look at the people around you and see how fast they're performing or the intensity they're bringing to the table and think that you need to match that. Because I think there is kind of this monkey see, monkey do attitude in that kind of environment where people are like, oh, I'm supposed to be going fast like these people. You're not. And it's okay if like the guy before you, it took him 10 seconds to get through a stage and it takes you 55 seconds to get through that stage. That's totally fine. No one's going to be upset at you if that's the case. Go at this pace that you're comfortable going. And eventually, like, you'll go from a crawl to a walk to a run. Mm-hmm. And that comes with experience. Mm-hmm. Most people don't show up to their first match and immediately make B or A class.
No.
Very rarely do I see somebody like immediately compete at that level.
My first qualifier was a D class. Like, right. And then I think I had the rest were like low C's. So like I barely like, now granted, I'd been shooting for, 9-10 years over at that point, but it was all a different mindset of training. So you go to a a competition, well, and we've talked about this episode, it's very different of how things work, different type of training. So yeah, I was in a low C, and now I'm mid to high B. So it's you can see that progression. It's like pretty much like you said, everybody will start at bottom and work their way up, and it's fine. Like, it happens.
I think in Steel Challenge, I started my career at C class, and by the end of the year, that same year, so I started in March. By the time November rolled around, I'm pretty sure I'd made A class by the end of that year.
Nice.
Made Master class the following year, and then I made GM.
It was this year, wasn't it?
Yeah, early this year.
Yeah.
So early into my third year. And so, like, you can progress fairly quickly. I've seen people do it faster than that. But it's it's a matter of, like, once you know what your limits are, then you can start to try and push them. And then you can start to see yourself, like, really succeed and get to the place that you want to be, based on like pushing your comfort level a little bit. But you don't need to do it right off the bat, is my point.
That's some great advice. With that, I think we're probably good to wrap up. So I guess one last thing that I wanted to cover, just as folks who are finishing this episode, and we'll put the information into the episode description as well. So again, can you run us through, Tyler, the things that new shooters would be that they need to have to go into their first competition? So like holster, belt, how many mag pouches, how many rounds, your recommendation in how they should be getting that firearm and that gear and their iPro and things like that to the match, water, snacks. So if you wouldn't mind just running through, hey, this is Tyler's recommendation, and then we'll make sure to put that list in the episode description so folks have that.
Yeah, great. I'm going to expand it a little bit too, and I'll just kind of broadly cover, like, we'll talk about skill level, equipment, things to train for, and kind of put that all together. So, just to summarize what I mentioned earlier, as long as you're able to chew gum and walk at the same time, meaning, like, can you draw from the holster, do manipulations with the firearm safely, like, while also thinking about other things, you're ready to go to your first match. Minding that you're going to take things slow and get used to it. But if you feel that you're at that level, that you don't need supervision on the range, you've practiced these repetitions enough that you feel comfortable doing them, you're ready to go. At that point, I would say, have a range bag, have something. I went to my first match carrying a backpack around, like just a regular JanSport backpack full of equipment. But, like, having a nice range bag is good, so that you can have your iPro, your EarPro, your firearm, your magazines, a place to store them off of your belt. So that's also, I'm glad that we're bringing this up again because that's important. Like, bring your handgun in a case, like, even if it's a soft case, off of your belt. That way, you aren't, like, just kind of loosely manipulating it outside of the holster if you need to bag it up for whatever reason. Magazines, your belt. If you have a cart and you can bring things like water and snacks, definitely bring water. Definitely bring some snacks. Have something to carry them in. So a cart would be nice, but you can lug it around on your shoulder if you need to. Sometimes bring a chair. Let's be honest, like, especially at Steel Challenge, because the stages are longer because you're shooting them a few times each. Having a place to sit down in the hot sun is nice. And, you'll start to figure out pretty quickly, like, what you're missing in your range bag as you're going to matches. Like, the first time that you start to have malfunctions and realized, oh, I didn't clean my gun and I don't have any lube with me, that's probably something I should add to my range bag. And, like, maybe I'm going to bring a wire brush in case I get dirt in my magazines and I need to clean them out, like, between stages. And, you'll start to pick up on all these little things that you're bringing to matches. I always have a couple rags, some lube, hand chalk because, eventually you start to get sweaty and you want to have a firmer grip on the gun. And, now we're getting into the nerd stuff, right? But yeah, have those kind of essentials are good. And then you start to expand on that through experience. And then I would say that like to get ready for your first match, go to the range if you have a range where you can do some movement, and do some basic movement on your own and maybe set up multiple targets. I know that not everyone has access to a range that allows for dynamic shooting. And so if that is your case, your kind of trial by fire might be, the first time that I'm like moving with my gun and shooting is at a match. That's not the end of the world. That's okay. Like I said, just take it slow. But if you have the opportunity, get out there, put maybe 3 targets up and do some basic drills where you draw, engage a target, move to a second position, engage a target, perform a reload and engage that first target again, and just kind of get used to the idea of I'm doing more than just shooting while standing still, and you don't have to incorporate those all in movement. Eventually you might get to the point where you're running around doing your reload on the run, shooting as you're decelerating into position, all that fancy stuff that you see in competition shooting videos. But in the beginning, just have that capacity to have a list of things that you need to do in sequence and that you can do them comfortably and safely without flagging yourself, without dropping your gun, God forbid, without pointing it up
DQ.
Range. That's another DQ, dropping your gun. We've seen it happen. These things happen. But if you can do those things and you have that equipment, you're ready to go.
Awesome. Any closing comments, Jim?
Yeah, I guess the last thing is, we're now 4 episodes in, and just want to keep emphasizing to the listeners, feedback is a gift, and we really want to, keep that line open to people who may want to hear about a specific topic, or if they have questions, please let us know. We are in the process of getting a website up, so really excited to get that out to you. Don't have a time frame yet, but Marvin and I were kind of getting things going, and we'll have a website in the foreseeable future. This isn't like it's going to be tomorrow, but it's not going to be 3 years from now. It's going to be probably somewhat soon. So we got a new email address. We have info@buildingthebasicspodcast.com. So yeah, feel free to send some feedback to us at that email address. We also have our Instagram page, which is @buildingthebasicspodcast. And then in the future, we plan on doing some video content for our YouTube channel, talking about some of the topics that we've been discussing in our first few episodes, and then kind of pairing that up with the content that'll be coming in future episodes. So really looking forward to it and helping you all make some really good decisions. Tyler, just thank you so much for today. It was a lot of really good chatting, and I'm sure that people will be finding it very beneficial. So thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was fun, guys.
Thanks.
Have a good day,
We'll talk
everybody.
again soon.